Hello, thanks for everybody coming out on Father's Day. I appreciate it. And the weather's great out there too. So it's even nicer that you all got here. And I want to thank the Albuquerque Historical Society again for hosting this screening. They've been great. This is a third or fourth one of mine that we've shown here. And as you probably read in the promotional material, this is a piece focusing on South Broadway and Kirtland Addition neighborhoods and the East End Addition neighborhood, which you'll learn more about in this film. This is the seventh film in a series of neighborhood profiles that I and my filmmaking partner, Charles McLean, have been producing for GovTV for about 6 or 7 years as part of a series we call Neighborhoods at a Crossroads, and which focuses on historic Albuquerque neighborhoods. Previous films have featured Martineztown, Bareilles, Wells Park, Alamosa, Thomas Village, and Hoffmantown. We're currently working on a piece on Taylor Ranch, and after that, we're hoping to get started on the International District, which is actually more than one neighborhood, but we're going to bring it all together here. So started here. Thank you for coming again, and hope you enjoy the film.
In the early 20th century, African Americans made up a tiny fraction of Albuquerque's population. The 1910 census showed 244 blacks in a town of 11,020, most living in the downtown area. That would begin to change in just a few years as the Great Migration found African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow conditions of the Deep South in Texas for the North, the Midwest, and the West. New Mexico was one place where African Americans envisioned more opportunity and less oppression, and Albuquerque's South Broadway neighborhood, long a haven for people of all ethnicities and races, became the landing spot for many of them. For decades, South Broadway remained home to the largest concentration of African Americans in the city. While many lived in the neighborhood by choice, the reality was that racially discriminatory housing practices discouraged and in some cases prevented African Americans from living anywhere else in Albuquerque. Despite the challenges, the neighborhood produced prominent business people and entrepreneurs, politicians, civic leaders, activists, and athletes of all backgrounds, their lives informed by the unique experience of growing up in South Broadway.
I had family here. There were relatives of ours that were here that actually encouraged my portion of the Powdrell family to come here. They would visit us in Texas, and they would eventually say things like, when won't y'all come to Albuquerque? Leave this somewhat oppressed environment. Come to Albuquerque. It's got opportunities, it's got this, it's got that. It's a city versus a sharecropper's village. And we actually made the trek here in December of 1958, a week before Christmas. I remember it like yesterday. It was cold. And the thing I remember most about it, when we landed here, so to speak, we had a station wagon and an old 3/4 ton truck with all of our belongings on it. It looked like the Beverly Hillbillies of a different shade of gray.
I am actually a military brat. My dad came here in 1940 with the Air Force and never left. I'm the first child of 7 that was born in Albuquerque.
Well, my family came to Albuquerque back in 1930. My dad was 1 year old when his parents brought him out, and that's when we started.
My mother's father, Ernest, Glover came from Louisiana.
The original settlers were from Spain. And then they ended up in the southeast part of the state. And it's where they settled in a little town called La Jolla, New Mexico. From there, then my uncle got a job at the railroad. So then they moved to Albuquerque and they moved to 1414 Arno Southeast.
My Nunez family, that's my maternal grandparents, came from La Barca, Jalisco, Mexico, during the Revolution. And so did many families from around here. They all came from La Barca.
So we lived there. One of my aunts lived across the street there. The Bernies lived here. My grandmother and them lived in that house, and my other aunt lived in that house there. So when they all moved from Roswell, they moved right next to their mom, my grandmother.
And so my mom's and her sisters followed their sister here. And my uncle, my dad and his brothers followed him out here. So everybody met here in New Mexico in the 30s.
I moved to Albuquerque from Northwest Texas with my grandmother, which I already had an uncle living here, and he just taught my grandmother to move in here. And so I started when I was 12 years old in the 7th grade here in Albuquerque.
Because we lived south of there, south of Gibson, probably about 8 blocks on the east side of Broadway. Arno, 2818 Arno is where we lived. And it was a meager beginnings, man, I tell you. It was a boxcar. And we shared another couple of rooms with a house next door. That particular house, it was kind of a place where when you came to town, people would say, hey, you know, there's a space down there. You can start there. And it was 13 of us, parents and 11. And it was tight, boy. Tight, embarrassing, because we left a home on a farm that my dad was a sharecropper for. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. Land up the yin yang, you know, and so we stepped down, you know, as far as that's concerned, living quarters, that was tough on us. The thing that we all knew, because we were prepped to make this trip, is that we were moving to a place of greater opportunity. And so as a young child, I thought opportunity, I didn't think about living accommodations, didn't think about that at all. And I guess it's, you know, looking back, it's what my parents had to think about to accommodate the family.
Today's South Broadway area encompasses Eugene Field and John Marshall neighborhoods, named after 2 of the first elementary schools built in the city.
When we did our first exhibit, we were looking at the early origins of the African American community, which were in downtown Albuquerque, so on Mountain Road and Marquette and Roma and Gold and Silver was where the African American community was kind of located, your bigger pocket, before it moved up into the South Broadway area. Once the first family moved into the South Broadway area, then other homes became available and African Americans started to migrate to that community, which before that had been a predominantly all Anglo community.
As the African American population grew, however, so did restrictions on where they could live. Years ago, said longtime South Broadway resident Eola Cox, the housing situation was such that a black person could not live in any area except the South Broadway area. Realtors made a conscious effort to sell houses to blacks only where it was acceptable for blacks to live. It was understood that if you were poor and black, that you lived in a certain part of the city where the poor and the black lived. Yet many residents who grew up there in the 40s, 50s, and 60s remember South Broadway as a nurturing environment.
We had a community that cared about us. And that's what I remember most about this community and the impact that it's had on my life. And it wasn't because I was black. It was because I was a kid out of this community.
I always knew that this was special because my parents felt it was special. They invested time and effort. And so I always felt it was a special place to live because we're Albuquerque's beginnings, you know, the core, the downtown core neighborhoods. So that means something. And it means something to me to this day.
For the environment and the generation that we grew up under, they always said it takes a village. Now this is our village and we have to raise these kids right. And so everybody took responsibility for everybody else's kids.
My little brother, he would get mad sometime and he's running away from home. It was like he read too many books, Tom Sawyer stuff. He'd actually had a stick with a little stack, a little bag tied on it, you know. I hope you don't put this, he'll be very pissed at me. But he's running away from home. We go down the alley. And pretty soon we get a call from Mag. Yeah, Mom. They tell my mom, yeah, we just saw him. He's headed down. Then he's hit right here. Then Miss English will call. Yeah, we just saw him. So we knew he'd be back by dinner. But they tracked him. You know, the whole community. People knew each other.
At that time, we're talking 1962, and that part of Texas that I moved from was still segregated. So in elementary school, I went to still segregated. I went to an all-black school. And then I moved here, and 2 weeks after I got here, I was enrolled in Lincoln Middle School, which was integrated with some of everybody, which was kind of unique for me all of a sudden, so to speak.
And maybe we were a little bit naive because we didn't see any of it. It wasn't until I left Albuquerque that I really started to understand that there were major differences between what you refer to as the races, because here in this neighborhood there were blacks, there were whites, there were Navajos, there were Asians, and so you'd have a girlfriend who was Navajo or who was Hispanic or white, and you never really thought about it.
I never felt any prejudice at all. We lived in the neighborhood where there were a lot of blacks, a lot of Hispanics, and a few white people. But I didn't see any of that.
In that neighborhood, race wasn't really an issue. I mean, they were your friends, and you went and hung out that way. And at Eugene Field, it was all mixed, and kids didn't even think about it. It wasn't until later that you began to get the feeling that people tried to differentiate you based on your race.
And growing up in the neighborhood of the Kirk and in the South Broadway, you know, it always taught me humility. You know, and always being humble, always being respectful for other people, because that's what we grew up learning. You know, the older people around here back then, they made sure we had respect.
That's what a neighborhood gives you, a little bit of security. Mental, economic, psychological, spiritual security. That's South Broadway, man. It had that.
Deal one. Mm-hmm. This is Okay.
The South Broadway neighborhood also provided a refuge and opportunity for an influx of Mexican immigrants.
They all left Mexico on train, on buckboard, you know, maybe walking. Some of them, they moved to a new world. They're getting away from the Mexican Revolution, which was pretty strong during that era. So they all left for a better life, is what I am told. So many of the families did settle in the Williams area, which I keep referring to. The Santiago, the Andrade families, the Rodriguez families, the Gomezes, Gonzalezes, all these families, and they found work in the Santa Fe Railroad, and also some of them became entrepreneurs. They opened up neighborhood stores. A trucking company, as I recalled, one of the families started up.
And it was a community where blacks, Native Americans, Hispanics all lived and got to get, you know, I think we all respected each other. And we all ended up at Albuquerque High, good old Albuquerque High. Like I said, there was no such thing as a race barrier in those days. Well, there was redlining for one thing, and this is the only place they could buy homes, you know that. And I guess that's one of the reasons you learn to get along with people.
I guess it did prepare us for life because we We walked with the blacks to school, to high school. We walked with the Hispanics. We had a few Anglos that we walked with, and nobody ever put us down on anything. You know, it was just a family. You know, we didn't discriminate because they were black or because they were brown or because they were white.
We were kind of appalled when we moved into a neighborhood, which I still live in, and the kids were going to go to Sandia High School, but they went to the elementary school in the area. But the kids in our neighborhood would call us names. They'd hang on the trees, and then they'd say, "Where are you going to go eat? A tico taco?" You know, they'd make fun. Oh, and then they'd call us chili heads and taco crunchers. And oh my goodness. But I never saw anything like that on South Broadway.
The Spanish and the black had a relationship that constituted the attitude of South Broadway. The Hispanics in the South Broadway area were entirely different, not entirely, but socially consciously different than Bareilles, than Martineztown.
Even before South Broadway, African Americans in Albuquerque had a long history of entrepreneurship. The Bryant brothers had started the first messenger service in the city in 1912, for example. So as South Broadway grew, it was not surprising that businesses followed, some owned by African Americans, others by Hispanics and Anglos.
So wherever African Americans moved, they had their own businesses because they were segregated from the business as a whole. So you had your own rental places, you had your own boarding houses, you had, you know, your own newspaper, your own construction company, your own, you know, so there were, I think that's one of the things that's unique about the South Broadway and the African American communities is the amount of entrepreneurship that you have.
If you look at the early to middle 50s, and this neighborhood right across the street was the only grocery store that was in the neighborhood for roughly about 10 or 12 blocks. You had a company called Rake's Variety Store, which was down on Broadway, which had a pharmacy in it. It had a lunch counter. You had Jones Barber Shop. You had dry cleaners. The neighborhood was basically fairly self-sufficient.
South Broadway had a solid business kind of corridor on Broadway. We could shop and do things among ourselves in these neighborhoods.
You had people coming into Albuquerque, fully educated, university degrees to become teachers and other professions who were not able to do that because of institutional racism. But they took those skills that they had, so they would take the jobs that were offered, you know, post office, railroad, you know, porters and that type of thing, but they would also take those monies and turn them into entrepreneurial endeavors. So in addition to, you know, working on the train, I also run a newspaper, I also own real estate, you know, because that was how you use what you had to build your community and to redefine your community, to have all the resources that every other community in the city had.
Perhaps the most famous business to come out of South Broadway is Mr. Powdrell's Barbecue, started in the early 1960s by Joe Powdrell's father, Pete Powdrell. It was one of several barbecue restaurants in the South Broadway area.
My dad had barbecue places in Texas. You know, we had a place in Crosbyton, had a place in Midland, Odessa area. Dad's grandfather, he had an uncle that had barbecue places in a barbecue place right outside of Fort Worth, Texas. So, you know, barbecue had come through the lineage of my dad's mother's father, the Britt side of the family. So the entrepreneurial inclination that my folks brought to Albuquerque with them, I was always impressed with that because, you know, it's what replaced pulling and chopping cotton and hauling hay and doing stuff for farm labor. And this place here where we are right now is number 4. But in the line of sequences, this is probably the 11th location that we've moved around to. Yeah, we moved a lot. We went from Broadway to Gibson to San Pedro and Catherine to East Central to downtown to Montgomery and San Pedro to here. We had a place on Coors. I'm gonna tell you, if there's anything that I really love about Powdrell's, we are a point of reference. I have people come in here and they say, hey, is anybody here that look like me in Albuquerque? I say, yeah, I just had to come by here, man. Your food's good and stuff like that, but what's happening?
While barbecue filled the stomachs of African Americans, churches fed their spiritual needs. Some of the area's oldest black congregations started in South Broadway or nearby downtown, including Grant Chapel AME, God's House Church, Shiloh Baptist, Macedonia Baptist, and Phillips Chapel.
Well, black churches play a critical role in maintaining the culture and the pride of black neighborhoods and communities.
And African Americans, church, it's all about church. Church is one of the, things are organizing home. It's political. It's just from slavery on. Church has always played a very important part in African American lives.
The black churches in the community were really a cornerstone of the environment and the experience that you had in that community.
Right here in the 800 block of William, there was a black church, and they played the best music. All the kids should be out there dancing to the music, because they really know how to have a service.
You could always go to the church and talk to the pastors. They were there that you can lean on. They were there to give you advice. They were just so active in the community itself. They were in the community, not only of the community. So I thought that was very good. So they had a lot of influence. They were the leaders in the community, and if you wanted something done, you dealt with the ministers.
Churches historically, not just here, but in the civil rights movement, that's where the message was. That was a safe haven. That was a place in which people did strategy. That was a place where people organized.
A lot of the black community's involvement in the civil social justice movement came out of the South Broadway area. The NAACP was housed in the South Broadway area, but you joined through the church. The then president of the NAACP had a relationship with the ministers, and he would say, take these memberships, get everybody in your organization to join. The black consciousness of Albuquerque came out of that area.
Religious observances also played a large role in the lives of the neighborhood's Hispanic and Mexican families. One of Albuquerque's oldest religious celebrations, the Fiesta of Our Lady of Guadalupe, has been held every December in South Broadway for nearly a century. The fiesta, which has its roots in Mexico, continues to this day, overseen by St. Francis Xavier Church.
The fiesta celebration and the procession itself began in the 1920s, when Our Lady of Guadalupe was, our Blessed Mother. As Catholics, that's how we see her. And going back to the Mexican-American families that moved here, they brought their customs, traditions of placing hilos, papeles across the street, the streamers that we later we know now as papel picado. And so all of these customs were just a joy to the neighborhood, and all the community, as I said earlier, participated.
My mother got me involved when I was probably about 7 years old as an angel in the procession. So they have the mariachis, and then they also have the parish priest. They have the people involved. They have altars. They have the altars that the procession goes by.
Whatever culture
all coming together because our Blessed Mother wants her children to be united in love.
The fiesta involves a 9-day novena before prayed at the church or in people's homes, and I'm going to this in my book. And then vespers are done, vísperas are done the night before the actual fiesta celebration, which is a liturgical service, a Eucharistic Mass that's done by, and we invite, the bishop is always invited, and so we have local clergy and other visiting clergy that will participate in La Fiesta, and they also walk through the streets with the rest of us, and the Knights of Columbus join in and lead the procession. Up to this point, we're nearing the 100-year mark. It'll be in 2024 will be a 100-year celebration, and hopefully it'll be a grand celebration.
Back in the early 1900s, a South Broadway youth by the name of Owen Spaulding smashed records in track and field and eventually went on to play in the Negro baseball leagues. He is considered by some the greatest athlete ever to come out of New Mexico, but he was just the first of a number of athletes from South Broadway who made sporting history.
You had a guy come out of Albuquerque High School by the name of Owen Spaulding. Jim Thorpe was the winner of the Olympics in 1912, first Olympic. And he was a decathlete, all 10 events. Owen Spaulding had broken all of his records. And he was going to be the Olympic decathlon champion in 1916, which didn't happen because of World War I. He was the best high school athlete in the country. Right out of Albuquerque, right out of, quote, South Broadway.
What we used to do is we used to go down to the welfare department and get some of this powdered milk that they'd have down there. And in the South Broadway areas, as I say, between Bale, we're on Bale, but between Arnold and Edith, we used to actually line the alleys for track meets. And we had made our own broad jump, we made our own pole vault pit. So we actually had competition. And we had people that we sort of, we felt they were heroes, people like Ray Etherly. In 1960, I was in 6th grade, and they were at Albuquerque High, and they set the 440-yard record nationally. For Ray Etherly, Dale Blanks, all of these folks were our heroes growing up in the South Broadway.
So we would race against this block against that block, or 2 or 3 blocks. They'd come down and we'd compete. We had relay teams around the community. That played a lot in encouragement.
It was very competitive, very spirited, and that's where we spent most of our time, wanting to be like those guys that were at Lincoln and Albuquerque High.
I got interested in sports because of the neighborhood and what we did in the neighborhood. But it was my ticket to another level of understanding and living and enjoying.
I was busy the year round. I played football, basketball, and ran track. Football was my primary sport that I had the greatest success in. To cut it all short, I was all-state running back. In fact, I was a high school All-American, which is pretty unique in itself. I was a high school All-American at Albuquerque High, what that means is that you're one of the top 100 football players in the nation my senior year in high school, And so I was very blessed with that, and the thing that helped create that was that I played with a lot of good athletes that made it, to me, seem fairly easy.
Back then, as a young boy growing up in the South Broadway areas, we actually had people like Johnny Pena and Donald Zimke. They were Hispanics, but they all actually hung out with all the brothers. And so they were all the same. We didn't look at them as Hispanic or black. We all played basketball, football.
But we kicked ass, man, in all the sports. But it was a brotherhood between Hispanics and blacks and the Caucasians. It was a brotherhood that made that area produce a unique athlete, a unique student body. We had the best band, I thought, excuse my prejudice. We had the best chorus. You know, track team, we kicked everybody's butt, man. And so that was kind of the attitude that you developed, I developed, a lot of other people developed in Albuquerque at the time. So when we competed against the Heights schools, they got to get ready to play because we had confidence. There was a confidence you get from having a consciousness.
There were battles to be fought. We all came together as a community.
Perhaps fittingly, South Broadway resident George Freiberg became the first white athlete in the history of the University of New Mexico football program to share a room with a black player in the early 1960s.
Coach Marv Levy came in and took over, and my junior year, my roommate was Don Perkins. But we didn't think anything about it. I mean, we never talked about it except maybe saying, why are people making such a big deal about this? And given where I grew up on South Broadway, that was no big deal. I didn't realize till later when Coach Levy himself told us, don't you know why I did that? He said there was no reason to have that sort of segregation, and so he wanted to kind of stamp it and say, this is the way I see it, and you ain't gonna have it around here.
I ran track, okay, and I was lucky enough, I was a sprinter, to go to the National AAU Championships, which back in the 60s, my goal was to go to 68 Olympics. And I qualified for the Nationals and ended up in this heat with Chi Chan of Nationalist China, 3-time Olympian. In fact, the announcer goes through Chi Chan, National China, 3-time Olympian. Wyoming Tires, Tennessee A&I, 2-time Olympians. And they went through this whole group of women that were Olympians. And it said lane 4, Jane Powdrell, Albuquerque Olympettes, and the crowd says, who? I placed the 5th. It was the best time I'd ever ran in the 100. You know, people would say, well, weren't you disappointed that you didn't win or you didn't do? I had, at that particular time, I competed against some of the best female sprinters in the world, okay? And I thought, if I can run against these women, I can do anything. And that anything came from me having the guts to run against them from this neighborhood, because they never told us we couldn't.
While African Americans made strides in business and sports, in 1950, a report ordered by the City Commission noted that discrimination against Negroes is widespread, and that the practice of discrimination against Negroes in Albuquerque is increasing rather than decreasing as the city grows. Nowhere was that problem more evident than in housing. As the post-World War II boom took hold in the city, however, a couple of options would soon become available. One became known as the Kirtland Addition, but the first was a neighborhood in the Northeast Heights near Wyoming and Lomas Boulevard, the East End Addition, developed by Virginia Ballou, a young black entrepreneur.
My grandfather and some other local businessmen formed an association called the Fraternal Aid Society. They had a vision. They had become recipients of the Homestead Act, where I know my grandfather received, I guess, 140 acres, and you had to live on it and develop it, and then it was yours, you know. And so they all had these plots in the east area of Albuquerque, northeast area, and they were visionaries. All these men, they saw Albuquerque growing towards the mountains. They said, you know, they felt like that was where the city was going to be. And my grandfather, I remember, would talk about Albuquerque that was where the center of town was going to be, and that we were going to have these, you could get on this highway and you could go from one end to the other. You could go from one end of town to the other without any stoplights, and you can get there in a matter of minutes. And that's today's freeway, modern freeway. He called it a super highway. So they knew that Albuquerque was going to be a place, was going to hit it big one day. And they were, they wanted to make sure that African Americans had a piece of the pie. My grandfather, Papa Outley, had planted the seed in her when she was a teenager. When he sent her to secretarial school, he sent her there with the purpose of her learning skills to be the secretary for the Fraternal Aid Society. Of course, by being secretary, she knew what the intentions of the group was, and so he died before he could see this land development into reality. She wanted to carry forth the dream of the Fraternal Aid Society. So she was looking for a contractor, and she couldn't get in. First of all, she couldn't get money from the banks. The banks didn't want to loan her money, and she was African American. She was a woman, and she was young, and she was in her 20s when this was all going on. So this did not, so she was not a good candidate for them to put their money, invest in her. So she heard about this black contractor, J.S. Jones, in Phoenix, Arizona. And he was an architect, and he was a builder, and he also could fund quite a few of his projects. He had a mortgage company. That had to be around 1949 because my brother Johnny was born. My mom, she built the first 3 homes, and they had the grand opening. I remember with all the flags and the balloons and the having people come and play music, and it was just a big affair. They served food and stuff. And then the thing was just to try and sell it, the first lot. And the first family that stepped forward to say they wanted a home out there was the Roy Palmer family. And my mother said, once they bought the first lot, then it started rolling after that. And she built some 30 homes there. People who had worked on the railroad, people that worked for the post office, people that were teachers, like the Jules. And there were some people that worked out, the Robinsons worked out at the base. So you had and then there was people that retired here from the military and got jobs with the government, federal government, so the federal employees. She was really being taxed to death, as she said, and she could not afford it until she was selling a lot of the lots and getting rid of a lot of that land just to be able to meet her financial finance problems. And so she said, I remember her saying, well, they can meet on the golf course and in the country clubs and make the deals, and what goes on in the office is just a mere formality where they sign the papers, but all the deals and the discussion and the negotiations have been done in places that she was outlawed, that she was not allowed to be members of, or to so she felt like she was really squished out. And she eventually had to give up the whole East End Addition. And I believe the last home was probably built in the 1970s. She was disappointed because she had lost all control of that. And I remember her saying, I was way before my time because I was a woman, I was African American, and I was young. And all those worked against her, she said. And so she felt disappointed. And, that really bothered her.
For people like the young Tommy Jewell, however, the chance to grow up in the East End Addition was a godsend.
Mom and Dad had the house built on Vermont, I had just gone into the 2nd grade. And so while this is before I-40 was a feature, and they were just putting I-40 in and other infrastructure. Like I said, they were putting in a combination junior high, elementary school, Hayes and Buto on Texas. I think when I graduated from Manzano in 1972, there were 3 blacks in my class of 750 or so kids. So I mean, it was pretty obvious that we weren't in large numbers, and I can say that aspect of growing up in the East End Addition was nurturing, because I was around people that looked like me. I mean, Albuquerque High might have manual arts and mechanic arts, and Manzano and Sandia would be college prep in their orientation. So I mean, there was always that sense of tracking, certainly in the back of my mind, that made me say, man, you know, I'm kind of lucky to be up here at Manzano, because my aspiration level, I think, is a bit different. I'm certainly clear about the concept of East End Addition fostering more migration of black folk out of the geographic ghettos, South Broadway and Kirtland. I can definitely say that it impacted me in terms of being one of 3 in a class of Manzano High School, and having the opportunity to go on and do things that I considered significant.
Dale Bellamy Homes developed the Kirtland Addition near the Albuquerque Sunport in 1951 to provide housing for military personnel stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base. African Americans in the military became some of the first to move there. Gradually, it became a destination for African Americans from South Broadway who desired better housing stock and the ability to own their homes.
Ownership was really important. We came to this place for ownership. Leave a place where you can't own to a place where you can own. And I know that was what was driving a lot of other people. The migration of black people to this place, a lot of it was motivated by ownership. You had a home builder here, I think it was Gene Bellamy. And I hope I'm not negatively presenting them, but they took advantage of that. They built the Kirtland Addition. And the first people to occupy that space was a lot of military African Americans.
Kirtland Addition was very similar to South Broadway area. It was a small community. I can go down the street and name families on each of those streets that we all knew.
We arrived in New Mexico as a result of my father being in the Air Force. And he was stationed at Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And because of that, he fell in love with New Mexico. He just liked New Mexico. So he decided, notwithstanding how many tours and where we went, that was going to be our home base. I think he chose Kirtland Addition because the housing was affordable. It was a neighborhood we could, we were allowed to live in. So I know, I'm sure he explored where we could live and where he could afford to find a home for all of us.
The Kirt was the upscale housing versus what we call the sticks in the South Broadway area. And so you had a lot of the people buying those new homes up there that could afford them. And then they built the Upper Kirk, which is up, both of those up by the airport. And so we felt that, those were the rich folks that lived up there in the Kirk and the Upper Kirk back in those days. So there were the big homes, and as opposed to the folks in the sticks.
We were the Lower Kirk, and the Upper Kirk had a few more Anglo families up there. The neighborhood was predominantly black. It was very open, very friendly. We'd run down the street and, before our parents got home, and hang out with our friends who lived down the street. And there was a little corner store that now is Mount Olive Baptist Church. It was like a little Circle K, a little neighborhood market. We would run down there and get candy that we weren't supposed to be getting. It was, you know, it wasn't as, now you're so aware of crime and, you know, doors are locked and you have security doors, and then it was open and trusting, and the worst of the gang activity was you'd hear of a knife, you know, every now and then. One of the bad boys of the neighborhood who I grew up with, you know, it was the knife, you know, that was threatening. But you didn't hear gunshots, you didn't. It was a different time.
While laws were passed locally and nationally in the 1960s outlawing discrimination in housing, the practices were slow to disappear.
The racism was probably there, but probably didn't realize until later stages of my life. For example, when I went to college, came back out of the military, found out that people like Eugene Willard came up to me and said, you know, we can't find any housing. They won't rent to us. And that was really a shock to me. And then I talked to Dr. Linton Mallory, who lived in the Ridgecrest area. He was saying that basically there were the covenants that were up there that you can't sell to Jews or blacks or Hispanics. And that was in the covenants. And they said they had to go and fight that battle in court.
It was not just the restrictive covenants. It's the fact that people couldn't get the financing in certain situations to locate where they wanted to locate. And that tended to make people stay in South Broadway and stay in Kirtland.
We had a very active NAACP in the 60s here. I was a member, and the number one thing we worked on was integrating houses. Houses were still segregated.
So you got Carnes and Oliver Salisbury and their daughters, Patricia and Olivia, and they come to Albuquerque in '63, relocate because of Mr. Salisbury's health. And when they relocate here, they buy a home in an area that I guess was considered by covenants not to be where they should be, in the Northeast Heights, I believe. And from what their daughter describes, Patricia Salisbury describes, is they saw neighbors coming to the door and they thought it was a welcoming committee, but it was kind of like raisin in the sun. They were coming to offer them more for the home than they had purchased it for if they would leave. Yeah. And Patricia says, and her dad was like, we could make a racket out of this. But from that, they petitioned, they started becoming very active in getting fair housing legislation in the city of Albuquerque, so that would not happen.
Mallory recounted his own attempt to buy a house in the university area in the early 1960s, a story that many African Americans could relate to.
We went through the neighborhood just east of Yale, down Stanford, Columbia, some of those streets, and we picked out 3 houses that we wanted to look at. So it was a Friday afternoon. So I came back, I called the Brown Realtors, and the guy came out at 9 o'clock that Saturday morning. He knocked on the door. He looked at me and said, "You guys are Negroes." I said, "Yeah, all our lives." He said, "Those houses were sold. All 3 houses sold on Friday night?" "Yep. I'll show you a house in the Kirtland Addition." I said, "That's okay, thank you, bye-bye." So that afternoon I told Joe, I said, "Let's go look in the same area, a house by owner." So on the corner of Gerard and Hyder, there was a beautiful stucco home. And so I called the guy up. He was a professor, assistant professor at university. And I said, "Sir, we're Negroes, so you know." He said, "That's fine. Come on over. I'll reduce the price by $200." That was quite a bit back in those days. So we lived on the corner of Gerard. My life changed because I had my own home. It was in an integrated neighborhood, and we joined the First Baptist Church. We integrated the First Baptist Church, so my life had changed a lot.
Then Dr. Mallory wound up coming here, being the first black principal at John Marshall, right in the South Broadway area. And and then he was the first black to get elected to the legislature for 10 years, and the first black to be elected to the county commission. But, he was a trailblazer back then.
To understand the history of housing discrimination and its repercussions, you must go back more than a century to a time when zoning laws and housing regulations were aimed at preserving white neighborhoods. The means of enforcing segregation included racially discriminatory covenants and the practices of redlining and steering.
I grew up in the South Valley. I grew up in a neighborhood that is predominantly Hispanic population. We have lower to mid-level incomes. And I always wondered, why is it that we are so different from all these other neighborhoods, especially if you drive around Albuquerque? Why is it that there's a more predominantly white population in the Northeast Heights versus down in the Southwest? So it wasn't that it was necessarily a topic that I just kind of said, hey, this is, something that the world needs to know about, but I think it's something that needs to be talked about to answer questions, especially for people like myself who are growing up in these neighborhoods. So as I discovered the topic of racially restrictive covenants, it basically answered that question for me, and it prompted me to continue seeking more answers and looking back at the history of land use and planning, zoning, the built environment, and how it impacts our minority communities. The racially restrictive covenants were basically a way to enforce segregation. And what they are is they are an agreement, a private agreement between buyer and seller, and basically whoever owns the property, of who can and cannot live on the property. Racially restrictive covenants, just to get down to it, explicitly said, if you were not of white or Caucasian descent, you cannot live on this property. So as you started seeing a lot of blacks, African Americans, even some of the Mexican American populations migrating out of the South, into the rest of the country, they were trying to figure out, well, how do we keep our neighborhoods segregated? How do we keep our property values up? So at the time, they were using racially restrictive zoning. So these zoning ordinances that were put forth by the city through public policy were saying, hey, you can't live here, and that's what did the segregation. So when that was ruled unconstitutional, then you saw an increase of the racially restrictive covenants. The difference between those two is the racially restrictive covenants, they're private. They're not a public policy. They are something that's between owner and seller. It is something that is recorded with the deed when the property is sold or purchased, and it runs with the land. So FHA came in and they said, hey, because we want to make sure that these home values stay the same, it is best if neighborhoods are occupied by the same social class and race. So in order to back up these racially restricted covenants, we're also going to deny any kind of mortgage insurance for African American families that are trying to live in these areas. So these two ran parallel together.
When he was a University of New Mexico graduate student in the early 2000s, Stefan Scott said a discussion with friends prompted him to investigate the issue of racially discriminatory covenants in Albuquerque.
So what I do now is I do civil rights work for the federal government. I'm a senior policy advisor for the director of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the National Institutes of Health. Actually, there was a specific debate going on amongst me and a couple friends, and they said, in this back and forth, the conversation was around, well, we're not in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Stefan, where you're from, where you grew up. This isn't the East Coast. This isn't the American South. This is New Mexico. This is the Southwest. This wasn't like that. And I said, really? I said, what would make you think that Albuquerque would be any different? And I said, well, I don't know, but I'm gonna go look. And when I looked, I found. I wanted to look from 1940 to 1948. That was my window. And so once I set those parameters, I went to Bernalillo County Clerk's office. I pulled, I had to get organized around how the city was mapped at that time. I wanted to find every neighborhood I could that was constructed in that time frame. And then once I found that, I wanted to find the associated deed with that neighborhood as it was constructed. And I believe, if memory serves me right, every deed I found had the racially restrictive real estate covenant language within it. Pretty much the entire city was developed based on racially restrictive real estate covenants. And so this is an example, probably a prototypical example of systemic racism, because you see the end product was racially restrictive real estate covenants. What you don't see is how it was done and how it was systematically done from the Fair Housing Administration, the formation of the Fair Housing Administration, helping and under the underwriting manual that was published by the FHA in 1936, which even helped with the language. So these are federal actors, federal agencies. So teaching, banks and federal housing institutions of how to restrict, racially restrict and segregate American citizens one from the other. And that means the federal government was not lending the money unless you had the racially restrictive language within it. There was also the notion of redlining, that where banks, and redlining is a method by which banks would literally draw using a red writing utensil to circle or encircle a neighborhood and not commit funds to those neighborhoods to improve them. In other words, say that particular neighborhood is so, I'm using air quotes, blighted, that we're not going to commit funds to that neighborhood. It's not worth the investment. The risk is too high. And therefore, once a neighborhood is redlined, then it doesn't get the necessary resources it needs to come out of a blighted status.
So when there's a redlining and when they denied mortgage insurance, that didn't mean that they couldn't purchase homes, but it made it a lot harder to purchase homes for the people of color, these communities of color. Let me give an example. So if you were an African-American family and you wanted to purchase a home in a red zone that was redlined by one of these maps, in order for you to purchase a home, you would have to put 50% down. And you would only have 10 years to pay it off. And that was a conventional loan. So it was just a general loan that didn't have any kind of federal protections. You couldn't get mortgage insurance on it. But it was very high risk, almost predatory. That was a huge burden. They didn't have that extra money to upkeep their home. So if the maintenance on the home couldn't happen, then you had homes that were depreciating in value. And therefore, they didn't have equity. They couldn't take out that equity to send their kids to college. They couldn't take out that equity to do home repairs. They couldn't take out that equity for medical costs. So it created a domino effect.
So I believe that absent redlining and absent structural racism in housing in Albuquerque, that neighborhoods like the Kirtland Addition and South Broadway would be more affluent.
For the African-American family that purchased on a conventional loan, they accumulated generational debt, not generational wealth. When redlining was outlawed and the racially restrictive covenants were no longer enforced, middle America, or just a general population, particularly white Caucasians, were like, hey, look, racism's gone. Look, we're doing our part to get rid of racism and end segregation. But that's not necessarily true. Just because you erase a practice, you don't erase the consequences. These racially restrictive covenants and redlining have such lasting negative impacts that our neighborhoods, our communities of color, are still battling it.
Some of the effects of housing discrimination were felt in South Broadway and Kirtland Addition as the neighborhoods fell on hard times in the 70s and 80s. Drugs and gangs, which afflicted much of the city, took hold in these neighborhoods. Attempts by government to address poverty through programs like urban renewal and model cities did not have the intended impact.
Like any old neighborhood, our neighborhoods go through cycles, you know, of prosperity and up and down, of things happening. It appeared to me, from where I came, from my perspective, a lot more poverty, a lot more African Americans, lower income Hispanics and African Americans living here. And it was just it was a little tougher neighborhood than when I grew up here.
It was a poor neighborhood. A lot of people rented their homes, and they were struggling. I mean, it was a lot of them was on welfare. A lot of them had jobs too. Some of them had jobs, and but they were struggling. The community was struggling when I was there.
So urban renewal came in and said, wow, look what we did to these poor neighborhoods. How can we help? Oh, let's go ahead and dump all this money and let's allocate some federal funds to dump back into these neighborhoods. It's a bit hypocritical that the government's like, oh, we're gonna exclude these populations because they don't belong and they don't subscribe to a certain identity. And then they grow a conscience and say, oh, okay, let's dump some money in. But who was that money benefiting? Was it actually benefiting the neighborhood? Was it actually benefiting the residents?
Yeah, when urban renewal came in, some neighbors left. There was a house behind us, and they were moved out. It was pretty run down. I think the Ramirez's were moved out. They lived on Commercial, and they moved out because of urban renewal. Homes were fixed. 2 houses down, urban renewal came in, but it was shoddy workmanship, from what I could see. You know, whatever they could save money at, they did. But I'm not sure it helped at all, because what they couldn't fix, they moved. And you lose neighbors. You lose the essence of a neighborhood, because people who cared about each other are gone now. And no, I don't think it was a great move. But anytime you let the government run things, you're going to have trouble.
When we first moved into the Kirtland community, it was a very nice community, very neighborly community. You knew people. When drugs started coming into that community, and drugs were going into all communities, but because we were a red line community, that meant when drugs came into our community, so were the police. And the solution to a social issue was policing. It was not, there's drugs coming into this community, and maybe we should start doing programming at the community centers to enlighten people about what's coming in and what are some of the strategies to deal with this, what are the strategies to deal with your young people. None of this is going to happen. It's going to strictly be the police are coming in. So I would say the late 80s, 90s, you're seeing a transformation. You're seeing police presence all the time. You're seeing gangs. So literally the Crips and the Bloods and the Reds and the Blues, because Joe was taking one of our employees home who lived right up the street from us, and he worked for us, and he was in his red work shirt, and they surrounded him. The police, both of him and the young man, and they had on red Padrel shirts, and they had to justify their existence. So your community starts getting viewed as a not desirable place to buy a home, to raise children, or any of that.
So what happened to the black community within the boundaries of the, quote, South Broadway? It lost its soul because of some deficiencies. And I think that's a little bit of a tragedy. Because what the city was getting from that area, which was just hard pressed in terms of some of the things that make you civically healthy, the city lost a little bit of its soul behind not providing some things that were being provided in other neighborhoods.
But those that stayed behind realized the only way to remedy problems of drugs, crime, housing discrimination, and lack of resources was to organize. Groups like the South Broadway Neighborhood Association and later United South Broadway Corporation sprang up to tackle those issues.
It just seems like our neighborhoods are always under siege. You know, if it's not one wave of something coming, it's another, okay? So we take our neighborhoods back from the drugs and we start to do other things, and then we get new leadership in the city or wherever, and that starts to change your neighborhood. This neighborhood had open air drug dealing going on, big time. And that's when I got very active with the neighborhood association, and we began to look to see what can we do about this neighborhood, because it was not only that, it was not just local people, but more importantly, it became a hub for people that were from all over the country that were looking to sell drugs.
People would come down from all over the city to buy drugs there. It was bad. And I think even one of the LaZoya boys died from that. Sugar's son also died from that. One guy was killed at the park from that. Yeah, it was heavy at that time.
We started meeting about it and meeting with, law enforcement and looking to see what we could do. And so we realized that monthly meetings weren't going to do it. And so we decided we have to do public demonstrations. And that's when we started doing our Peace in the Street campaigns. Every Friday, 6 o'clock, we came home from work, we put on our hats, put on our tennis shoes, got our shakers, put our signs up, and we were tracking. We were marching down the middle of the street one day, and drug dealers on one side, and we're walking by, and I'm looking in a car. There's all this money and drugs and a gun. And then I get calls, and some of us others would get calls in the middle of the night with the guns clicking in the phones, and they were targeting us. But we thought, you know what? This Fannie Lou Hamer, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. So we're going to do this.
The efforts resulted in closing down more than 100 drug houses and 2 clubs that were magnets for crime.
And so people began to be more accountable. So we went through that whole process, and somebody nominated us for National Neighborhood of the Year, and we went to Pasadena. We did a simulated march for that event, and we won the prize across the board on every category. We won every category as National Neighborhood of the Year. So we took charge and took ownership where we had not before. And that was some years ago. Think about it, 1994 when we won National Neighborhood of the Year. But I think what it tells, there are still pieces of that in place. There's still a sense that this neighborhood can rally together, that we can have a call and response.
So you have no problems with the minutes that you're reading?
Frances Armijo has long been active in the neighborhood. She served as state representative for the district from 1988 to 1991 and now heads the South Broadway Neighborhood Association. She too believes residents must take the initiative to protect and improve their community.
So in September, there were 2 auto thefts, 1 auto burglary.
It's always extremely important for a neighborhood to get involved and participate. I mean, as I've always told people, get out and vote. Get out and vote, because when you vote, that's the area they pay attention to. But they don't believe me. I really imagine if you saw everyone from South Broadway, or even 2/3 of us getting out to vote, they would start looking at us the way they do a neighborhood in the Heights, Ventana Ranch, anywhere, because we get out and vote. You would get better everything in South Broadway if people got out and vote. My sister asked me why I care about this neighborhood. She said, you're so tired all the time, and you get so upset. And I said, because this is where I live. This is where I live. And if I don't care, who's going to care?
Activists still have plenty of issues to tackle. United South Broadway Corporation, for example, launched initiatives to end racism, predatory lending, and home foreclosures. Meanwhile, the Neighborhood Association addresses concerns about gentrification, zoning, and economic development.
As they talk about economic development, stop with the used car lots, all right? Stop with that nonsense that the IDO allowed. Give us something like the bakery. Give us a coffee shop. Give us the Dairy Queen again. Give us somewhere to go, and stop telling us that whatever development goes on all over the city that's going to benefit us. It's not.
So we have to be very careful about the work that we do around revitalization and that kind of thing, because we can revitalize our butts right out of our own neighborhood, and in some ways we have. If we're gonna save our neighborhoods, we have to fight for them. And nowadays the fight is not. I mean, we have a toolbox, okay, and it consists from direct action to legal action and everything in between. And that's what you have to be prepared to do. And so I feel like my responsibility at this point is to use any influence that I may have to open the door or make the connection between the new people that are coming into the Historic Neighborhood Alliance, the young people that are there now, that we've been able to recruit into this, the young planners and neighborhood people that grew up here that are vested, to help them get that work done.
In the face of changing demographics, residents believe the biggest challenge in both South Broadway and Kirtland is to preserve the culture and heritage of the neighborhoods.
It's a neighborhood that's losing tradition. We're sacrificing our tradition anymore for change. The people are moving here not because they want to be part of what we are, but they'd like to change it. And we are seeing changes, and we're not happy with it. You know? So, yeah, it's a poor neighborhood. There are working people, but there should be respect for the way people are, and they want to be.
My response to them is, if you came from another neighborhood that you like better, you should go back. But if you're going to stay here, don't try to make my neighborhood yours, because after all, you left there for some reason. So surely you didn't want to make my neighborhood the neighborhood that you left. So join us in what we're doing. South Broadway was a gateway kind of neighborhood. I still consider it a gateway neighborhood, and I'd like for it to stay a gateway neighborhood, where people are welcome, that low-income people can come here, get their start, either stay here and build their families here, or see it as a way in which they can, if they choose to move forward in a good way. So I always want us to be a neighborhood, because it brings that diversity of people into the neighborhood, and I think that's good, because when we were doing our marches, oh God, Diana, you guys did that, and with all the different people involved. I said we did it because, as a result of that diversity, we had the diversity of thought, okay, and problem solving. And so I think there's a richness in that.
There's an African, it's kind of like a proverbial story about this older gentleman. He's sitting in, he's looking at the ocean. And it's about in the sunset, and the water's coming in and it's going back out. And he's sitting there, and this kid says, didn't the blank blank tribe used to be here? He never looks at the kid. He keeps looking at the sunset in the ocean. He said, yeah, they used to be here. He said, well, what happened to them? He said, they got disconnected from their history, and they vanished. When I think about South Broadway, the implication of tragedy, that old man didn't say it was a tragedy, but to vanish, a little bit of a tragedy.
If South Broadway, Kirtland, and East End were to disappear tomorrow, it would not erase their profound impact upon Albuquerque or the legacy of world-class athletes like Owen Spalding, pioneering politicians like Lenton Mowry and James Lewis, celebrated musicians like jazz pianist John Lewis, and even Nobel Peace Prize winner statesman Ralph Bunche, who spent 2 important years in South Broadway. But current and former residents are not ready to give up the fight.
It's almost like it's being tied to Native American, that sense of ownership and belonging to the land itself, and to the structures there and the people and the family and the history, then it's not so easy to give up.
It's just refusal to accept that definition of what your community is and who you are within that community. So it's knowing that out of this community, some of the most known leaders in the city, had been part of this community, and they become, people were school teachers and politicians.
We're not battle worn or tired. We just know that it's worth it. It's worth us taking on a battle for our neighborhood. You see people coming and going, but underneath all that, there is a strong set of connections, bonds that bonds this neighborhood, and a lot of pride about what we have here.
But I just think my strength that I got from that community propelled me to be successful. The stick-to-itiveness, the don't quit attitude. If you want to be successful, you got to give it your all.
You had a true understanding of what was right and wrong. You also grew up with an appreciation of how things affect other people other than yourself. I guess if you could boil that down into one word, would be a sense of humanity.
When I ran the first time, I sent out what's called a friend and family letter to ask for donations. And I sent out 100 letters, and I sent them to all these folks down here. And they gave me, some of them didn't give me but $5, $10, and they rolled it up. And they said, Janie, make us proud. It wasn't about me being Republican. It wasn't about any of that. It was a little note that they put in there. And that's what I remember about the community. That's why I love this community.
was one of the most challenging ones I've done, and one of the most rewarding ones. I felt really proud to have finished this one. I wanted to just let people know what's in the rest of the film. Of course, we saw the beginning talking about Kirtland Addition. There is more discussion about Kirtland near the end of the film, along with South Broadway. But following that, the part that we were just about to go into, we spent a good deal of time talking, we alluded to the housing discrimination issue. And my partner and I had made a decision at one point that we really needed to explore that. This was the right film to do that with. We had been doing Hoffmantown before, actually it's been more than a couple of years ago. Pandemic has screwed up time for me, but it was back a ways. And when we were doing Hoffmantown, we had heard somebody had been referred to us who was a pastor of a church up in the neighborhood. And he had one of these deeds that still said Negroes or African Americans and Orientals are not allowed to live, or not, you can't sell this property to them or rent the property to them. And got to, thought that was kind of interesting, but Hoffmantown wasn't exactly the place to go into that story. And then a few months later, I don't know if people saw, Larry Barker did a piece about the discriminatory deeds. And so we just happened to have South Broadway up next, folks who were directly, specifically affected by these laws and stuff. So we spent a good portion of the rest of the film talking about these discriminatory deeds and how it forced people into these three neighborhoods. That's why we chose these three neighborhoods, because until the mid-60s, really, that was literally the only, there were a very handful of African Americans who bucked the system and got houses in the Northeast Heights, but it was extremely rare. And these were the three neighborhoods that they could actually not have a problem going into. But the other problem that we talk about in there too is the problem of redlining. And I don't know if you all know what that is, but basically banks, and this happened all over the country. This wasn't Albuquerque. That's kind of what we talk about in this last part, how it was kind of a systemic thing. It was happening all over the country, but it also happened here. But banks, if they redline your area, you can't get conventional FHA loans. You can't get insurance sometimes. You get really bad terms on the loans that you do get. For instance, somebody talks about it in here, instead of getting a 30-year fixed rate, you get a 10-year loan on a house. You've got to pay it off in 10 years. Of course, you're paying that much more every month. And of course, the average family, they're going to, if they can scrape enough money to pay the mortgage, that's fine. They don't have money for upkeep. So the houses typically deteriorate in these redlined areas. And so as somebody mentions in there, it's like, in other places you inherit generational wealth through your homes. Here, families were inheriting generational debt. And so we just thought this was a place, I know a lot of people know about it, but a lot of people don't know how this works. And just to say that these discriminatory deeds were there, we felt we needed to go into some more depth on that. So that's part of what will be in the other part. And then finally, we come back, to the neighborhoods themselves, Kirtland and South Broadway, and talk about the 70s, 80s, 90s. These were really rough times for both neighborhoods. They were seen as drug and, a lot of problems with drugs and crime. Now, as they will point out, as people who, that's why we talk to the people who live there. It's like, when you look at the statistics, it was no worse than any place else in the city. But probably because they think, it was a racial issue. And that was kind of the picture that was painted in these neighborhoods. And then we talk about like Diana Dorn-Jones, you saw there, a community activist, and Francis Armijo. They organized stuff in the early 90s. They organized groups, neighborhood associations, and fought back. And they had this thing called Peace in the Streets. in which they had marches through town or through South Broadway I think she said it was every Friday after work or something. And they'd get the whole neighborhood out and they'd go by, and they'd particularly go by houses they knew where they were selling drugs and make a point of stopping there. And it got pretty scary. They got threats and everything for doing this from the drug dealers and stuff. And then they even had people who were home during the day. They had little forms to fill out. If you saw a car driving up to one of these drug houses, they took the license plate down and everything, and then they sent a letter to the governor's office, the state attorney general's office, APD, everybody saying, and to the person, if they could track them down, this car has been seen at a known drug house. We want you to know. And anyway, they did this whole combination of things and started cleaning up the neighborhood. And South Broadway was named the National Neighborhood of the Year back in like 1993 or something. They were honored all over the place. So anyway, that's a little bit of what it's about. It's still, it's not always. It's not always a pleasant history. This neighborhood went through some rough times, and they're struggling still to kind of hang on to the cultural and historic legacy of what they have down there. Most recently, they had, I think it was probably about a year and a half ago when they were talking about building a soccer stadium down there. Well, if you talk to the folks that live down there, like, nobody asked us, somebody up in planning decided this was a good place to put a stadium. And then they had the whole plan, and then they came and told us about it. Well, they kicked them out basically. And the election, was defeated for funding it. But that's the kind of stuff they're still dealing with today. The problems change, and then there's the reverse problem now of gentrification for them. The property values are going up, and now the issue is how can they keep the people who live there forever in the neighborhood? So it's Diana Dorian Jones says that it's just one thing after another. We're always fighting, but we're not going away. We're going to preserve this neighborhood. So, and then before I take a question here, I just want to mention we're really happy to find out last week that the raw interviews we did for this piece, which is it's over 20 hours of just raw interviews, are going to be archived as part of the I See My Light Shining project at the Oral History Archives of Columbia University. So, very special. So,
why them?
I'm sorry?
Why them and not UNM?
UNM might. We haven't approached UNM. Somebody came to us.
Oh.
There's a gentleman who is working in town right now who is with Pratt University, and he's working on a project to collect oral history. He got a grant to get oral histories from African-American elders in New Mexico. And he found out what we were doing, that we'd already done this piece. So he contacted them and they said, yeah, this is exactly what we're looking for. So we're gonna get those. So yeah, we may get them at UNM. I try to get everything into Center for Southwest Research over there if I can, stuff like that. So yeah. So anyway, questions? Yes.
Can you talk about the South Broadway Cultural Center?
We did in the original, and we weren't able to. The original piece was 2 hours long, and there were just things we had to cut. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do a lot with the South Broadway Cultural Center.
Could you repeat the question for the audience?
Oh, I'm sorry. Why didn't we do anything on the South Broadway Cultural Center? That was why. It was a matter. There was a lot of great material we just had to cut out. It's just unfortunate. Oh, I think it's mentioned later in the piece, and we show pictures of it. But yeah, but we weren't able to. It deserves a piece on its own, basically. I mean, that's something.
My grandfather came to Albuquerque in 1905 and bought the residence that was at 1013 Broadway, which is with the South Broadway Cultural Center, which is now the Albuquerque Library. And for people who are looking for a reference on who lived where, when in that area, when we cleaned out my mother's house in 2007, we found the abstract of title that the company gave to either my grandfather or my dad when they cleared the title on that piece of property. And abstracts tell who lived where and all the surrounding,
great.
not just that property. But so that's at special collections at the library system, if anybody wants to know more of that. And the other thing that we found was my dad had 2 duplexes on the property that he rented, and we found all of his receipt books for the rental. And we gave those to the South Broadway Cultural Center, and it's a stack of receipt books. It tells the date and the name of the person that lived there and how much they paid for rent at that time. So those 2 things are on file, and people are looking for information about who lived where when at the South Broadway Cultural Center.
Okay, and you said that you mentioned special collections also. Is there?
The special collections got the abstract. The South Broadway Cultural Center got the receipt book from the duplexes when he rented the receipt books for the rentals.
Yeah, and I was just gonna, one thing, if I recall right, I think I got this right. We showed Rake's variety store there, and I think that's where the South.
When we moved out, I lived on South Broadway from 1946 to 1956, and when we moved, Raker Rexel Drugs was brand new. They came and they bought a vacant lot that was there on the corner, and then there was another little old house, and then there was my grandfather's house.
Oh, okay.
So then the city of Albuquerque came and bought the whole area.
Yeah. Rake's had actually been, I think, in further east. The original Rake's was further east in the South Broadway neighborhood, and then they moved to that location. Yeah.
So we were, I grew up there in the 70s, and it was the South Broadway Library at that time.
Yes.
The old Rake's. And I mean, we hung out there. That's what kept us off the streets and safe.
Yeah.
You know, that was our place to hang out. There was reading groups and all kinds of things. And then later they expanded into the cultural center. But for a long time, that was just a nice haven for the teens.
Yeah, lots of people had very fond memories of that Rake's and the library and everything. Yeah, everybody we talked to had been lived at Rake's for all I know. But we actually we found those photos. How did I do that? I was doing a little genealogical research or something, and I tracked down the grandson of the original Rake's owner who lived in Oregon. And I called him and asked if he, had any photos, because we checked the archives here, Southwest, every place we looked, and everybody knew the place, but nobody had a photo of it. And he said, I can look and send you something. He said, but my nephew lives in the East Mountains. He's got all kinds of stuff. So that's where we got the photos from for that. So, yeah.
I worked for the public library and had occasion for 4 months to be the branch manager at South Broadway when we were short-staffed. But we can't talk about that place without calling it the Model Cities Library, which started out as a very special approach to libraries in the late 60s, early 70s. And can't leave without saying Evangeline Quintana, Marge Armijo, and especially Myra Durr.
Okay.
The spirit
Duly noted.
Of that place.
Yeah, no, people have very, very fond memories. We did the premiere screening of this film at the South Broadway Cultural Center and heard all kinds of good stories that night, everybody.
I'd like to make a comment. I am the Spalding family. The old man was about 5 years old, and I remember him telling me about riding the train with Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, no.
And I knew George Freiberg and the Bellamons.
Oh, you did? You knew George too? Oh, great.
And his sister Shirley, we went to school together out Turkey and I.
And what is your name?
I'm George Ritchie.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it should be noted, doesn't Special Collections have the entire yearbook collection of Albuquerque High? I don't know if it's special, does
It
genealogy
went,
center
it's
have
in
that?
Maine Library now.
Okay, so
Yes.
Maine
We
has it.
have duplicate copies at special, and I don't think that's complete, but the more complete one is the genealogy.
You know, so really, you know, that yearbook collection of Albuquerque High tells such a story of history, of families and businesses and. I mean, it's-
We got a lot of them. Joe Paldrell actually had a bunch of them, at least for the years he was there. And then you can find almost all this stuff online now. If you join something like Classmates or something, everybody's got their yearbooks online. But yeah, they are really fascinating. And as you saw, almost everybody we interviewed, we found their high school pictures somewhere, usually from Albuquerque High. Yeah.
And these two teachers from Eugene Field were saying that it's going to have like 100 birthdays or something.
It could be pretty close. It was the first or second school in Albuquerque.
1926.
Yeah. Yeah, and Letton Mowry was, I think Letton Mowry was the, who's in the, later in this piece, was the first Black principal. He was principal there in the 60s, I believe, early 60s. He was the first Black principal in APS, and it was here at Eugene Field. So, you know, I went to the school there. They didn't have a picture of Eugene Field, unfortunately, but I was looking for that. Yeah.
And it says in the material for today on the Historical Society, they even had a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Who was
Ralph
that?
Bunch.
Oh.
Now, I'm sorry.
I didn't know he was from Albuquerque.
He lived here temporarily. He went to high school at Albuquerque High, but I found references where he said these were some of the most important years of his life were the few years that he lived in Albuquerque and went to school at Albuquerque High. And then, yeah, he became a U.S. ambassador or something and won a Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah.
Reflecting on some famous names, was John Lewis in that area?
We mentioned John at the end of some of the whole list of famous people that came out of that. But yeah, John, he was asking about John Lewis. John Lewis was a pianist, I believe, and started the Modern Jazz Quartet, which was one of the big jazz groups of the 60s and 70s. And unfortunately, we couldn't find any. I think we found the house where he lived. We couldn't find anybody that knew him.
They should name a school after him.
Well, they named the auditorium at the South Broadway Cultural Center after him.
I'm sure a lot longer than Ralph was. Yeah. You even went to UNM for a while, I think.
I'm sorry, who was?
I think John Lewis. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He was here for many years.
Yeah, yeah. And he grew up, James Lewis, I think, was one who told us that he grew up in the Sticks part of South Broadway. So, yeah, hi, Sharon.
I lived on South Walter for years. My son went to Albuquerque High School, and I noticed you reverence Joe Podrell in there. What people don't realize was that he taught at Albuquerque High School for years, and he was a coach, and the kids worshipped him. My son would have walked through walls for the man, and
yeah.
They reached a point where the family business needed him. And so he reluctantly, because he loved teaching and he was a wonderful coach, but he stepped back, he resigned from teaching and went full-time into the family business. And he's, and I think he is still the pillar of that business.
Yeah, him and his, I think it's his cousin that runs the one up on East Central. And Joe's still down there, and Joe and Rita are still down there running that one. Brenda Dabney, who was in there briefly talking about Virginia Ballou, who built East End Addition, she just died recently, about 2 months ago. So we were really fortunate to get her interview when we did. And that's one of those ones, you know, if we ever get these things archived and anybody's interested in going back and look at the raw interviews, that was definitely one of the best ones we did. Brenda had so much history and information. It was great.
Tony, how can we encourage local government to either invest more in what you're doing with these neighborhood archive films, or just to do, I worry every time I go to yard sales that Albuquerque history on a regular basis is just going in the dump. You know, photographs and scrapbooks and things about neighborhoods and people. And I mean, so really what you've done with this film series is very important to salvage that.
Janet was asking about how we can do more of these and get funding for it. I've been exploring that for quite a while and still haven't come up with the answer. One of the things, you know, we've taken some small steps. All these videos, except I just noticed today, South Broadway is the only one, but they're all on the library website, the city's library website. There's a page dedicated to those. And that's another way that we get them out. And I've talked to, well, Kathy and various people before her about whether, you know, I don't know if people still use DVDs, but if there was some way to get the whole block of these out to schools, for instance, as part of a curriculum or something, I think that would be one of the best ways to do it. That's just something I need to follow up on. I guess you could nominate me for an award. I don't know. Something like that. In the back.
I had a question for you too. I heard the East End Addition was up for historical overlay zone designation at City Council. Did that ever come to pass?
It
The
did.
law where they made East End Addition.
I believe it did. Yeah.
I was watching the city council one night at about 11 o'clock when it happened.
So it did pass. It's a law now. It's a designated district.
But there's so few properties still there. You know, she sold almost everything close to Lomas to car dealerships. So a whole bunch of houses got torn down.
Yeah.
What remains, like at least the block of it's still there?
I think like a block.
Yeah, there's, yeah. The question was about East End Addition and whether it got a designation as a, I don't know if it was. What was historic, yeah, overlay. And I think, yeah, I do think that's true. But yeah, there's not, you saw the plans, there was several blocks. I mean, there was plans for a hospital, there were plans for shopping centers. I mean, they were thinking of building Windrock before Windrock came around. Yeah. That's when she was saying they were visionary. She wasn't kidding. They were going to build out everything out there. And her grandfather did know exactly what was going on. As you say, the Honda and a couple of the other car dealerships have bought up a lot of those houses. There's one completely intact block. I think that was Virginia that we showed with about 18, 20 houses on it. And then part of another block, just over, to the east, I think. Yeah.
Well, we have Loretta Naranjo Lopez, and she's actually running for city council for that district, District 2.
Oh.
This is her right here.
All right. Plug for city council candidate. Yeah, what was it? Another question?
Oh, I was going to say, someone in the audience had asked, what does it mean to be an historic overlay zone designation? And so that's the city of Albuquerque can adopt an ordinance where they they draw a box and say, this is an historic district. We're going to do an overlay law over this. So for development inside the box, you have to consult with the Urban Landmarks and Conservation Commission, right? That's what overlay zone means. So like, if someone wants to get a zoning change, they have to consult with the Historic District Commission and say, well, we'd like to do a car dealership on Virginia Street. They can say, no, that is not consistent with this law. You cannot put a car dealership on Virginia Street. It's supposed to be historic houses. So that's the point of that law change, is that little strip, that little remnant of East End District will be protected from becoming the next used car dealership.
Yeah, hopefully they're not going to sell any more of that off. But as you saw, we showed the sign. There is actually a sign marking it. If you're driving down Lomas and turn left onto Virginia, you can see the sign still there. Yeah.
One of the things I'd hoped to see in your film was a bit more of the history of that Borellis area. I think it got started.
Borellis?
Borellis is a different one.
South Broadway, excuse me.
Okay.
Things going on. And I think it got started about the 1890s with the railroad, and that became an area Santa Fe workers settled.
Right.
Right against the roundhouse and all that. And bring not bring, but do the steam whistle for people to come and go
Right,
at the various
right.
hours.
Yeah.
So it was, very vibrant, a lot of working for wages people right in that area.
Right.
That's why they were able to buy the properties through that whole thing. So.
Yeah. And I'll say, and you're absolutely right about that. One reason we probably didn't go into that as much is we have done Borellis, where we talked quite a bit about the railroad and the surrounding neighborhoods and stuff. And again, it was, I think we talked a little bit about it in the narration about the railroad coming in and people working there, but.
We'll have you back to show Borellis.
Yeah.
We'll have you back.
Oh, we'll show the second half.
The story of South Broadway in the late 1800s, early 1900s, up till about 1950, was the same story that you're telling of opportunity. My one grandfather came here from a big farm in Belen for opportunity in Albuquerque to own a business. My other grandfather moved from Belen for opportunity to work at the Santa Fe shops. And it's the same opportunity program with the South Broadway neighborhood. It's what you were telling it from the 1950s and on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of missed that little piece of the New Mexico Hispanic community that
At that
that
time,
came
it was
to
all
Albuquerque.
Hispanic and all Catholic.
Yeah, and then St. Francis was kind of, I went to St. Francis.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we included them here, and also we have done, we have quite a bit about the Hispanic experience in old neighborhoods. We've done Wells Park and Borellis and what's the other one? I'll think of it, but we've done Martinez Town and stuff, so we have some of that there too. We did make a conscious choice to focus a little bit more on the African American community for this one.
It would have been a 4-hour.
Oh, it was, I was just saying, it literally was over 2 hours, the first cut that we had of it. And I thank you for staying this long to watch it. I know people don't have long attention spans, these days. And so we had to cut it down to more manageable size. But there's, as I say, in the raw interviews and stuff, we've got just some amazing stories. So.
Well, thank you so much. If you haven't joined,